In this video, we'll be talking about the basics of a statistical study. So specifically, we'll be looking at samples, populations, parameters of interest, and then a variety of different sampling techniques. So the first thing we're going to talk about is just the distinction between a population, a sample, and a parameter of interest. So whenever you're doing a statistical study, you've got a group that you look at that you're interested in. That's called a population. A sample is the group that is selected to represent the population. So say you've got a group of 1,000 people and you want to know something about them. That would be your population. Your sample would just be maybe the 100 people that you select from the entire population to answer your statistical question. The parameter of interest is the thing that we are interested in knowing about the population. So it's kind of like, what's the question or the quandary that we have about the population? Let's go ahead and do some examples so that you can see what this looks like. So let's just say in this first scenario, a grocery store wants to know the average number of items that shoppers purchase in each visit to the store. They decide to count the items in the cart of every 20th person through the check stand. So the population is everyone that we care about, so the entire group that we're interested in. So that would be everyone that shops at the store. Then the sample is just the group that we're going to look at. So which people are we actually going to go through and count the items in their cart? That's every 20th person. So we would just say that our sample is every 20th person. Then the parameter of interest, or the thing that we care about, is the number of items purchased. So we want to know how many items are purchased by everyone who shops at the store. Instead of asking everyone at the store, the entire population, we are just going to look at our sample, or every 20th person. All right, let's look at the next example. A team of biologists wants to know the average weight of fish in a lake. They decide to drop a net and measure all the fish caught in 3 different locations in the lake. So the population is all the fish in the lake. That's what we care about. We want to know the average weight of all those fish that are in the entire lake. The sample is just those fish that are brought up in the net at those 3 different locations. So I'm just going to put fish caught in net. So rather than somehow trying to empty the entire lake and get all the fish out, we are just going to look at the fish caught in the net in those 3 different spots. And then the parameter of interest, what we care about is the weight of the fish. So one thing to be aware of as you describe the population, sample, and parameter of interest is that you want to be as specific as possible. So, for example, in this one we just barely did, we said all the fish in the lake. We might want to put like in the lake that they're working on. Right? It's not all the fish in every lake. It's just the one lake that they're looking at. Okay? So the next question that we're going to start answering is, how do you decide what an appropriate sample is? So we've got this giant group, like for example in this in the fish example, we have this giant group of all the fish in the lake. And these biologists decided that they're just going to put their nets down in 3 different spots and just count all the fish that are in those 3 spots. So what we're going to look at is, how do you choose a sample? And that's going to be this next section of sampling methods. And there are tons of different ways to choose a sample, and they're going to be classified into 5 different sampling methods or sampling techniques. So I'm going to go ahead and go through some examples of these, and I'm going to use as a population my students. So let's just consider all my students, and my parameter of interest, the thing I'm interested in, is, did my students complete their homework? So there's 5 different ways that I could gather a sample of my students. The first one is called a simple random sample. And a simple random sample randomly selects individuals from the population. So that means that there's kind of like no rhyme or reason about it. In this case, I would just put like everyone's names into a hat, mix the names up really well, and then just pull out maybe 20 names. Okay, that would be a simple random sample. So everyone in my population has an equal chance of being picked. This is actually the most preferred method of sampling. So if you can get a simple random sample, that's actually going to be your best type, most reliable type of sampling method. Unfortunately, it's also sometimes the hardest one to actually carry through. You'll see with the other four that they tend to be a little bit easier to kind of organize and gather a sample. So there's something called a cluster sample. So in a cluster sample, you divide the population into subgroups. So you take like all 100 people, divide them into groups of like 10 based on some trait. And then you randomly select an entire subgroup. So for example, I could take all my students and I could divide them into groups based on what grade they got during the last quarter. So I have a group of people that got A's, a group that got B's, C's, D's, and then F's. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask everyone who got an A, a C, or an F if they did their homework. So I'm just going to look at all the people in the A group, the C group, and the F group, and I'm ignoring everyone that got B's and D's. So the next type of sampling method is a stratified sample. So stratified is pretty similar to cluster. You're going to start by dividing your population into subgroups, just like with a cluster sample, and then you're just going to randomly choose a few people from each group. So in my example of with my students, I might divide all my students based on the grade they got, and then I'm going to ask 3 people who got an A, 3 people who got a B, 3 people who got a C, and so on and so forth. And that's how I'm going to decide or answer my question about if our students completed their homework. Okay. So one thing that's important about this one is once you start choosing the people within like the group of people that got A's, it needs to be a random selection, right? So you can say, I'm going to put all the people who got A's names in a hat, and I'm going to pull out 3 of them. Those are the 3 people I'm going to choose to ask this question to. The next kind of sampling technique is a systematic sample. And this one is when you choose like every 5th or 7th or 20th member of the population. So maybe in my case, I might make a list of all of my students, and then I'm going to talk to every 10th person on my list and see if they did their homework, or maybe every 20th person, right? I'm just going to kind of choose an increment, and I'm going to choose every 10th or 5th or 20th person. So my last type of sampling technique is called a convenience sample. And the convenience sample, you just choose your sample based on the researcher's convenience. So I'm the researcher in this case. I'm just going to choose whatever people are most convenient to me. So if I'm thinking about this question during first period, I might just ask everyone who's in my class right now. Okay, the people that are absent that day, I'm just not going to worry about. I'm just going to ask everyone who's conveniently close to me. So convenience samples are obviously kind of the worst type of sample because you're not necessarily representing all of the people in the population, but they are the easiest as a researcher to do because they're convenient. So let's go ahead and just do some practice identifying sampling techniques. So we've got a list of 6 different scenarios, and we're just going to classify them as simple random samples, cluster samples, stratified, systematic, or convenience. So number 1, let's suppose that you are in charge of school activities. You want to know what activities students would prefer to participate in during the school year. So you decide to put the name of every student in the school into a big bowl, and then you draw 100 names out, and you ask those students to respond to a survey. So in this case, this is going to be a simple random sample. And it's simple random because every person's name is in the box, or in the bowl, and every person has an equal chance of being picked, right? You could pick out anyone's name from there. All right. So let's say, I think in all these scenarios, we're doing the same thing. We're in charge of school activities. We're trying to decide what activities students prefer. So starting right here, you assign each student in the school a number, and then you randomly select a starting number from the first 10 numbers and select every 10th student in the list from that point forward. So maybe you start with the second person on the list, and then you would do the second person, the 12th person, the 22nd, the 32nd, the 42nd. This is a systematic sample. Okay, we kind of have created a system for how we're going to get our complete list of people in our sample. And we're just going to kind of bust through that system, working through the entire list of students. All right, let's say in number 3, we use the roles from each first period class. You go through each homeroom or first period class and you draw 2 names from each class. Then you ask those students to respond to a survey. So this is going to be a stratified sample. So it's stratified because I start by kind of dividing all my students into groups, and the groups are, what's your first period class? Then I'm going to go through and I'm going to choose 2 people from each of those first period classes. So I'm choosing a small group from all the different subgroups. Let's look at number 4. It's very similar to number 3, but it's a little bit different. So I'm going to start the same way. I'm going to get a list of all the first period classes. But then I'm going to randomly select 5 classes, and I'm going to survey everyone in those 5 classes. That is a cluster sample. So notice that cluster samples and stratified samples start the same way. You start by taking your whole population, dividing it into groups. And then you either select a few, like an entire group, that would be a cluster sample, or you select a few from each group, and that's a stratified sample. Okay, let's say that you decide to stand in the cafeteria during your lunch break and ask students if they would be willing to participate in your survey as they walk by. This is most definitely a convenience sample. So you're just kind of standing in a place that you think a lot of students might be in the cafeteria. You're just hoping that some people will say, yeah, sure, I'll answer your question, or I'll do your survey. Okay, the next one is you make a lot of copies of the survey about the activities and put them on a table outside the cafeteria. And students can choose to take the survey and drop the responses into a big box on the table. This is also a convenience sample. One reason I know this is a convenience sample is because you're not asking anyone specific to take your survey. You're just kind of saying like, hey, anyone that is, wants to respond, anyone that's interested in this, go ahead and do the survey. So whenever you're not specifically like targeting a person or an individual, that's going to be a convenience sample. So as we've kind of looked through these different types of samples, hopefully as you read through them, you maybe thought, oh, that sampling method seems kind of unreliable, or hey, that sampling method seems like a really good idea. And that's kind of what we're going to get at next, is we want to talk about how we would analyze a sampling method. So we've got all these different kinds. So if you're like doing a study, how do you decide which sampling method you're going to do? So when you're choosing a sampling method, your big question is, how well is it going to represent your population? So remember, you're going to take your sample, and it's going to be like maybe 100 of the 1,000 people that are in your population. And you're going to say, just based on what those 100 people in your sample, how they respond, you're going to make conclusions about your entire population. So because of that, you want to try to make sure that those 100 people actually represent the opinions or the thoughts of your whole population. So that's this first thing, is we want to make sure that the sample is representative of the population. And a sample is considered representative of the population if it accurately portrays the responses of the entire population. So that means that if you were to sample your entire or ask your entire population a question, your responses should be similar, not exactly the same, but similar to what you would get if you just asked your sample those same questions. Another thing that you want to think about is something called the law of large numbers. And the law of large numbers just says that the more individuals that you include in the sample, the more representative the sample is going to be. So say your sample is like 1,000 people. If you interview 2 people and that's your whole sample, that's not going to be a very representative sample. But the more people you interview, the more representative your sample will be. So if you interview, say, 200 of the 1,000 people, I'm going to feel much more comfortable about agreeing with those kind of results than with a sample of 2 people. So what we're going to do is we're going to practice determining a sampling method and then just deciding if we consider the sampling method representative. Now this question, do you consider the sampling method representative? There's not necessarily a right or wrong answer here. what we're looking at here is we're just trying to figure out what are some pros and cons maybe of this sampling method. So let's look at number 1. You want to know the average number of hours that high school seniors spend playing video games in your state. You randomly select 20 high schools in the state and then ask all the seniors at each of the 20 high schools about their video game habits. So this type of sampling method is a cluster sample because you divided everyone in by their schools and then you just chose 20 complete schools to survey. Okay, so as far as representative, this is an opinion again. I would say that this is representative because you're surveying a lot of people. I'll kind of make a list. You're surveying lots of people and they're from lots of different schools. So one thing to consider here when you're deciding if it's representative is you got to think about how many high schools are in your state. So I would say in Utah, where I'm at, the 20 high schools that if you were to choose 20 high schools, it's probably a good representation of all the high schools in the state. But if you were looking at maybe a bigger state that had more high schools, maybe you'd need to choose 50 high schools in order to make it more representative. All right, let's look at the next example. So a shopping mall management company would like to know the average amount that shoppers in the mall spend during their visit. So they post 2 survey takers near one of the exits who ask shoppers to tell them what they spent as they leave the mall. So this sampling method, I would say, is a convenience sample because it's kind of just a really convenient way to catch people as they're on their way out of the mall. There's no requirement that anyone answers the question. And there's actually no guarantee that anyone even goes out one of the exits that they have the survey takers at. So I would say this sample is not representative. First of all, it only catches people that are going out one side of the mall. So maybe if that exits by like a really expensive store, then the people leaving there are going to have spent way more money than someone leaving like the food court or something. It's also just anytime you have a convenience sample and you're not requiring people or giving them any sort of like reason to take your survey, it's going to be hard to have it be a representative sample. The other thing is that this example doesn't really give us a lot of information about how many surveys they're collecting. So we want to think about how many people we're putting in our sample and is that enough people to accurately represent the size of our population.